I've never been a proponent of blind faith. As a Christian, I'm perfectly well aware that many other Christians do in fact have blind faith, and that has been sufficient for them. But that was never sufficient for me, as I've always been one to ask questions, to test things, and to know the reason why I believe what I do. And so when it comes to considering the theory of evolution, it won't surprise you that again, I struggle with understanding how anyone can accept such a theory with blind faith, without really testing it, and knowing the reasons why they believe it. All too often I've found myself in discussion with all sorts of folk, including atheists, Buddhists, and sometimes Christians too, who say they believe in evolution. But when I dig a little deeper, I discover, and they discover, that they actually have no basis or reason behind their belief, other than perhaps that's what they've always been told to believe. In other words, it's been blind faith. And in my research over the years, I've actually found that I now have more reasons to disbelieve the theory of evolution than I have to believe it. And this is what I'd like to present to you today. This isn't a Christian video, neither is it a secular video, but it is a video which may affect your worldview, the way you see things, the way you trust truth claims, and the way you test things. What follows then are, in my opinion, the 10 best arguments against Darwinian evolution. Although, of course, there may well be better arguments, technically speaking, nevertheless, these are my best arguments, the ones that have helped me the most in my assessment of it. But before we start, it's worthwhile just identifying some possible presuppositions that we might have. And so just ask yourself these questions, and be honest as to whether you can put any bias to one side as you consider what follows. Firstly, is there a God? If you believe there is a God, then this could well give you a bias toward believing the biblical account of creation rather than being objective in your assessment of evolution. But the same is true the other way around. If you're an atheist, or you do not believe that there's a creator God, then maybe you have a bias toward wanting evolution to be true, as it would be a useful alternative, and so your assessment might well be biased too. Either way, are you willing now to put your bias to one side? Secondly, do you consider evolution to be an indisputable fact, or would you concede that it is a theory? There is a huge difference, and your answer may reveal just how open you are to having your view challenged. Thirdly, do you think science is a closed topic, or is science open to change and amendment as new information is received? What follows are 10 arguments then that encourage us to consider evolution not from a Christian worldview or from an atheistic viewpoint, but simply from a common sense perspective. These arguments are not in preference order, but they are in order, as you'll see by the end. And the aim of this video is to help people like me to easily remember some of the problems with the theory of Darwinian evolution. You ready? Here goes. First of all then, equality. Are you a monkey or an ape? Richard Dawkins says that we're not merely like apes, we are apes. I wonder if we've ever stopped to fully recognise this. Darwinian evolution does not merely compare similarities between animals, it's saying we are merely another form of ape. Well, speak for yourself, Richard.
So we are apes, we are African apes. Since we're closer to chimpanzees and bonobos than either of them is to gorillas, we are a particular subset of African apes united with chimpanzees and bonobos, but excluding gorillas. So we are undoubtedly African apes by any standard at all.
But actually, he has a point, doesn't he? If we truly believe in the theory of Darwinian evolution, then that is all we are. We're just apes. Given a choice to rescue a baby ape or a baby human from being attacked by a lion, which one would you choose? And I wonder why. I would suggest that within our conscience we all know that we're not merely apes. Whether it's our ability to create, to discuss, to cooperate, to explore, to plan beyond our own survival, or even our ability to blush, humans are so different. And that's without even mentioning our spiritual side. But hey, this is simply my first point, which makes me raise an eyebrow at Darwinian evolution. To believe it is to also believe that we are just apes. But before I move on, let me just mention the darker side of evolution too, which is not so much about equality, but about how the theory has been the basis for inequality. Are we aware of the full title and its racist overtones and uses of Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. Take a look sometime and you'll see that the full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. For those who are interested, Darwin's theory of social evolution is even more dangerous than his theory of biological evolution. To be honest, I'm not sure how his statues have managed to escape the trend of racist statues that have been dismounted in recent times. Take a look at this quote from another of Darwin's books, The Descent of Man. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as at present, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. I'll just leave that up there for you to digest before we move on. If you believe in Darwinian evolution through blind faith, then just think through the implications. Are we so in love with the theory of Darwinian evolution that we choose to ignore its underlying message? Check out this video evidence for more. Darwin, Africa and Genocide. I'm inclined to reject Darwinian evolution on this one premise alone. But there's more. Variety. Firstly, we can recognise, of course, that microevolution does exist within species, different types of cat or dog or horse, etc. But just thinking about molecule to human evolution is wildly speculative. Just think about how complex we are. There's plenty of evidence for microevolution, for a finch to adapt to its surroundings and grow a larger or shorter beak or less or more feathers, or for a moth to adapt by developing darker or lighter wings. But an adapted bird is still a bird. An adapted fish is still a fish. An adapted moth is still a moth. This is all so different from the speculation that macroevolution is a fact. That one kind of animal can adapt into another kind. Isn't science, it's speculation. While we admire the design of nature being flexible enough to allow for such variety in dogs, cats, horses or humans, it's sheer speculation to conclude that one kind of animal can adapt, transcend groupings, and become another kind altogether. We're far too complex for that. Microevolution, or adaptation, is repeatable, testable, and provable. But whatever kind of animal we start with, we always end up with the same kind of animal despite all the changes. An adapted fish is still a fish, an adapted bird is still a bird, an adapted cat is still a cat. Macroevolution transcends the boundaries of a kind, and is neither repeatable, testable, nor provable. Therefore, it's speculative, not scientific. And to believe a single cell could evolve into a complex human is wildly speculative and undeniably faith-based. The third word I want to put up is overwhelming. In evolution, every mutation is a mistake in the genetic code, either a deletion, substitution, or insertion. The overwhelming majority of non-neutral mutations are deletions. Mutational effects can be beneficial, harmful, or neutral, depending on their context or location. Most non-neutral mutations are deleterious. In general, the more base pairs that are affected by mutation, the larger the effect of the mutation, and the larger the mutation's probability of being deleterious. The overwhelming majority of non-neutral mutations are deleterious, reducing, not increasing survival. This is easily demonstrated in the lab. Most mutations lead to a loss of function, not a gain of function. Evolutionary theory, it turns out, is great at explaining things like the loss of eyesight over time by cave-dwelling creatures. It's terrible at explaining gain of function. Neither does evolution explain the emergence of intelligence, an appreciation of art, sunsets and music, or our advanced speech and memory recall, or our sense of morality. Let's move on to number 4, the Law of Biogenesis, which states that there must have been a living first cause. Biogenesis is the principle that a living organism can only arise from other living organisms and can never originate from non-living material. Biogenesis is the production of new living organisms. Conceptually, biogenesis is primarily attributed to Louis Pasteur. The photo is there on the screen of him. And it encompasses the belief that complex living things come only from other living things by means of reproduction. That is, life does not spontaneously arise from non-living material, which was the position held by spontaneous generation. This conclusion is one of the central statements of cell theory. How did even the first living molecule come into existence from non-living matter? It's impossible, even with scientific experiments, let alone occurring naturally. There must have been a living first cause. Darwinian evolution provides no answer to our origin. Instead, it simply raises the questions: who or what then created the first living thing? Where did life come from? If life somehow, contrary to the scientific law of biogenesis, came into being all by itself and then evolved, then what is the purpose of life? Of course, these reasonable questions, although they can't be answered by evolution, they could also be asked of belief in God too. If God created life, then who created God? But then follow through the argument. If there is a God who created the universe, then God is necessarily beyond time, space and material, because these are elements of the universe. If such a God exists, then that God would necessarily be timeless. Such a timeless being must be infinite and uncreated. And so an uncreated first cause actually makes sense if God exists. So let's follow the logic further. Because in my opinion, there is more likelihood that such a God exists than for the universe to have created itself from nothing, and then for life to evolve from non-living material. I hope you can see that atheistic evolution requires blind faith on such things. Number 5. Evolution is unprovable, and so it's based on faith and not science. Is there just one unrefuted example of Darwinian macroevolution still around today? Darwinian macroevolution is not provable. At best, it's an interpretation of evidence, but this interpretation can't be proven, and the evidence could be interpreted in other ways, for example, creation. Evolution is the study of history and a theory based on what we think happened. That's not science. In any case, no scientific statement is ever formally beyond question. Science is always open to amendment as new data is acquired. You may have heard it said, all truth must be scientifically provable. That sounds very intellectual, very helpful, until we realize that this statement is itself not scientifically provable, and so by its own claim it cannot be true. So take care not to believe everything you hear just because it sounds intelligent or scientific. In its original form, science could simply be defined as knowledge. Today, however, science, in the view of an outspoken part of the scientific enterprise, is a systematic method of gaining knowledge about the universe with reference to purely naturalistic or materialistic causation. Science in this sense automatically rules out the notion of God because supernatural claims, it is asserted, cannot be tested and repeated. If an idea is not testable, repeatable, observable and falsifiable, it is not considered scientific. If an idea is not testable, repeatable, observable and falsifiable, it is not considered scientific. Evolution is unprovable and unobservable. It's a study of history and a theory of what we think may have happened. And therefore Darwinian macroevolution is based on faith and not science. It's not a scientific fact, but a theory, and a theory with significant flaws. So how could anyone say they know it to be true? You could only truly believe such a thing by blind faith. So, why do people believe such a theory? Perhaps simply because they're told to, or else because the alternative is special creation, which means God. Number 6, transitional forms. First of all, we need to clarify. Yes, of course, we know that fossils exist. Secondly, yes, we know that microevolution, adaptation, speciation, occurs. And so we should expect to find fossils that have adapted even from one species to another. But if all life gradually evolved over hundreds of millions of years through small mutations and variations which nature selected to survive, then surely the fossil record should show not merely the odd celebrated missing link between one kind of animal and another, nor even thousands of transitional forms, but we should be finding an unbroken continuum of fossils with billions of transitional forms, wherein differences are barely distinguishable, no gaps. Instead, we have animals and their fossils being clearly identified and separated according to their groups, their kinds, their categories. The fossil record's overall pattern is one of abrupt explosions of new biological forms, and possible candidates for evolutionary transitions are the exception, not the rule. This has been recognized by many paleontologists such as Ernst Mayr, who explained in 2000 that new species usually appear in the fossil records suddenly, not connected with their ancestors by a series of intermediates. New species suddenly appearing, not connected by a series of intermediates. That sounds like the opposite of Darwinian evolution and sounds remarkably similar to what a Bible-believing Christian might come out with. This terrible flaw in the theory of Darwinian evolution was recognized by Darwin himself. In 1859, when Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was first published, the fossil record was poorly known. Darwin described the perceived lack of transitional fossils as the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory, but explained it by relating it to the extreme imperfection of the geological record. I hope you noticed that Darwin himself called his theory exactly that, a theory. Darwin also famously struggled with the fossil evidence being revealed by the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of new animals which evolutionary theory has failed to explain. Look it up sometime. While we're on the subject of transitional forms, just a final word about our own supposed missing links in human evolution. Take a look at how the BBC describes the mother of mankind, called Lucy, a collection of 40% of a skeleton found in Ethiopia in 1974. Like a chimpanzee, Lucy had a small brain, long, dangly arms, short legs, and a cone-shaped thorax with a large belly. The article goes on to state that they think the skeleton shows evidence that this 3-foot-tall animal routinely walked on 2 legs. Sounds just like a chimpanzee to me. Hopefully you can see how the evidence is being viewed with a clear evolutionary bias. But here's some more news you may not be aware of regarding previous fossil findings. Heidelberg Man, built from a jawbone that was conceived by many to be quite human. Nebraska Man, scientifically built up from one tooth, which was later found to be the tooth of a pig. Piltdown Man, the jawbone turned out to belong to a modern ape. Peking Man, supposedly 500,000 years old, but all the evidence has disappeared. Neanderthal Man, at the International Congress of Zoology in 1958, Dr. Cave said his examination showed that this famous skeleton found in France over 50 years ago is that of an old man who suffered from arthritis. New Guinea Man dates way back to 1970. Cro-Magnon Man, one of the earliest and best established fossils, is at least equal in physique and brain capacity to modern man. So tell me, what's the difference? And then we have modern man. This genius thinks we came from a monkey. Darwin's problem persists. Though there are plenty of fossils, there are not nearly enough. Neither do they provide evidence of macroevolution, unless you're biased. Our 7th element is irreducible complexity. This argument states that some things can only be reduced in complexity to a certain degree before it's useless. Therefore, how could it have evolved? Often the eye is used as an example. But maybe a more practical question would be to consider why, if evolution progresses through survival of the fittest, have we not managed to evolve an eye in the back of our head to see what's coming up behind us? Now, I know that some may argue that if organisms became light sensitive, purely by chance of course, then eventually over time they may become better at it, and so eyes eventually evolved. But that really does belittle just how complex the eye is. and forgets the fact that evolution is random. It's not purposeful, and we'll come back to that later. An irreducibly complex system requires each and every component to be in place before it will function, and perhaps a better and more up-to-date example would be the complex but minuscule bacterial flagellum motor. It's a motor which enables a single-cell bacteria to move about, and without its constituent parts, it simply would not function. Darwin had no idea how complex individual living cells such as bacteria were, which isn't his fault. Microbiology wasn't that advanced. But now that we do know, are we humble enough to admit that maybe such things did not just occur by chance? Darwin would have thought that the very first cell was like a blob of jelly in some primordial soup. He would have had no idea just how complex even the most basic single cell is. But even if he did know, it doesn't answer the question of how did that first single cell in all its complexity evolve? Who or what put all its parts together? Our next ingredient consists of our DNA, which consists of 3 billion base pairs of coding. Only about 5% of the sequence consists of protein coding regions or genes. More than 90% of the genome is non-coding DNA, sometimes called junk DNA, that has no known function. Read that again. More than 90% of the genome has no known function. There is so much that we do not know. This one fact alone should make us extremely uncomfortable about claiming that Darwinian evolution is a fact. It wasn't that long ago that science was telling us that the universe is eternal. Hubble helped us to put an end to that with his theory of the Big Bang. But for thousands of years before that, the Bible was telling us that the universe had a beginning. So let's not be so quick to embrace the truth claims of today, and let us not be so quick to reject the truth claims of Scripture. Some people believe in Darwinian evolution because we've been taught that we share so much of our DNA with other animals. So let's take a look. It may be true that we have up to 98.8% of our DNA in common with chimpanzees, but these missing 1.2% represent 35 million entries into our genetic code which are different. It's a huge amount, and some say the likeness is more like 96%. Besides, we also share 97.5% DNA with mice, 80% with cows, 60% with chickens, and 50% with bananas. So am I part banana also? Don't answer that. Perhaps common DNA is more likely to point to a common designer rather than to a common ancestor. We're nearly there, folks. And the next one is non-purposeful mutations. People often forget that evolution relies on random, non-purposeful, unguided mutations, not purposeful mutations. Take a moment to let the implications of this sink into our thinking. Evolution relies on random, non-purposeful, unguided mutations. Any mutations are mistakes, not attempts to evolve. Do we really think this is how we became who we are? Through millions of years of mistakes, somehow, just working out. And even if we do believe this, then I am no more significant than the grass in my garden, or the worm below, or the insect above. All of us are simply mistakes of nature. Mutations can be beneficial, neutral, or harmful for the organism, but mutations do not try to supply what the organism needs. Factors in the environment may influence the rate of mutation, but are not generally thought to influence the direction of mutation. For example, exposure to harmful chemicals may increase the mutation rate, but will not cause more mutations that make the organism resistant to those chemicals. In this respect, mutations are random. Whether a particular mutation happens or not is unrelated to how useful that mutation would be. And you can add to that what we discussed earlier about the overwhelming majority of mutations being deleterious. When you're discussing this, do you think people realize that we're just a combination of mistakes? What is the purpose in life if we are no more significant than a mosquito? Our final ingredient then is extrapolation. Darwin's theory of evolution says if a car can go from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 1 minute, then perhaps it can go from 0 to 600 miles per hour in 10 minutes. His theory is based on extrapolation, using microevolution and assuming it can cross species, groups and all kinds of animals given more time. This is a false premise. Adaptation, variation and speciation is limited. That's why we have the distinct animal groups, phyla, or divisions which we have today. Also, Darwin thought the universe itself was unlimited. The scientists of his time were telling us that the universe was eternal, and so the time needed for life to occur from non-life, and then totally random mutations to be sorted through the process of natural selection to produce humankind from a single cell, purely by chance, that wasn't an issue. And so not only is extrapolation a false premise, but we now know, of course, that the universe in fact had a beginning. It's not eternal, and that's it. 10 arguments which help us to reconsider what we think we know of evolution, and to simply make us think more carefully before believing this theory through blind faith. But now I hope you can see why, in my opinion, these are the best arguments. Not because they're perfect, nor would I claim that other arguments wouldn't be better, but because they are the easiest to remember when you need them. If you do this in the same order, then this is what you come out with. My arguments are based on equality. If you believe in Darwinian evolution, then what is your purpose in life? You're just an ape. And follow through Darwin's social evolution and you'll reach some horrifically racist conclusions. Variety, which we agree occurs in microevolution, but which is a leap of faith and speculation to say it's true of macroevolution. The overwhelming non-neutral mutations are deleterious and harmful. The law of biogenesis reminds us that you cannot get life from non-life. There must have been an uncreated creator. Evolution is useless in speaking to our origin or purpose. It's unprovable and therefore unscientific. Darwinian evolution is a study of history and a theory based on the evidence. Those who believe in the special creation of God would interpret the same evidence but differently. Neither is more scientific than the other, except to say that to believe that nothing created everything sounds pretty unscientific to me. The lack of transitional fossils is a continuing problem for the theory of evolution. Yes, we have lots of fossils, but there are far too many gaps instead of one continuum. And add to that the sudden explosion of fully formed animal fossils during the Cambrian explosion, and evolution hits a major problem. The irreducible complexity of even the simplest bacteria with its flagellum motor continues to question how it could have possibly evolved. Then there is our DNA, often used as an evidence for evolution theory and a common ancestor. It could just as easily be interpreted as evidence for a common designer. And then we have the often overlooked reminder that Darwinian evolution is driven by non-purposeful, random, unguided mutations. That really is something we do not consider enough. All living things are mere accidents of nature. Finally, we added the false premise of extrapolation. Just because we may see evidence for microevolution, it's quite wrong to assume we can take these over barriers of animal kinds and believe that the same is true for macroevolution. What I've tried to do is shake any confidence you may have in blind faith for Darwinian evolution, just as I would for anyone who believes in any religious belief, without having truly considered the reasons why they believe what they do. But I honestly believe that the theory of evolution is nothing more than a red herring. Albeit a red herring that has, over time, developed legs, and has caught the eye of so many that they're distracted then from what truly matters. What truly matters is your relationship with the Almighty God. One day, each one of us will be held accountable before God, and we're all in trouble because we're all moral creatures, and we've done things which are morally wrong. As moral beings, we want justice, but we need forgiveness, and Jesus' death on the cross provided both. Why? Because God loves you. But I don't expect you to believe this just because I said so. I don't expect anyone to believe this by blind faith, so please, take some time to watch this video, which carefully pieces together the reasons why we can know God exists, why we can trust the Bible, why we need to believe in the message of Jesus Christ, all laid out in a careful, logical, reasonable manner. Your eternity is the most important subject of all, so please, take a few minutes to consider the evidence, and may God bless you.